Well, hello everyone. It's great to see so many of you signed up to this training session. As Carolyn has said, my name is Charlotte Tomlin and I'm a preventive conservator working for Spencer and Fry. The training today is going to focus on the museum environment, in particular temperature and relative humidity monitoring and control. I have to apologise in advance as the session is going to be heavily weighted towards me talking. Hopefully this won't be too onerous for you and you'll all learn something new. There'll be plenty of opportunities to ask questions. I will break every 20 minutes or so after each topic so that I can answer any questions that have arisen. Please feel free to ask questions about the training, but also any related questions about issues that affect your museum environment. As Carolyn has said, you can ask questions in the chat function and we'll pick them up from there. And as Carolyn has also said, I'll provide a handout after the session that will highlight the key points as an aid memoir. So let's get started. Let me give you a brief overview of what we are going to cover in the training session today. I will begin by introducing the agents of decay. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these, so this will serve as a short refresher before moving on to focus in greater depth on incorrect temperature and incorrect relative humidity. We will look at what is meant by incorrect temperature and incorrect relative humidity and what risks they pose to different museum objects. Once we understand the risks associated with incorrect temperature and relative humidity, we will look at how we can monitor and control the environment to reduce the risks. I will then introduce benchmarks in collections care to show you how they can reinforce and guide your learning in environmental monitoring and control. And we can't not mention the elephant in the room. COVID-19 has introduced new challenges for the museum environment. We'll discuss what these challenges are and how we can work to reduce the impact of these challenges. Introducing the agents of decay. For those of you not familiar with this term, the agents of decay, or agents of deterioration, as they're also known, are the variables that most threaten historic objects and interiors. It is generally a list of around 9 or 10 variables. The list can differ slightly between organisations, but the main variables are always present, and they are illustrated here. Fire, water, dust, pests, light, theft and vandalism, dissociation, which is the loss of the object or the information associated with it, physical forces, pollutants, and of course our focus for today, incorrect temperature and incorrect relative humidity, or RH for short. For most of the agents of decay, our ultimate aim is to eliminate or at least reduce their presence and therefore their risk to museum objects. Temperature and relative humidity are different, as instead of eliminating, they need to be managed carefully to achieve appropriate conditions. So what do we mean by incorrect temperature and relative humidity for museum objects? Before addressing this question, I want to make sure that we're all confident understanding the term relative humidity. So forgive me if you're already familiar and confident with the meaning, whilst I briefly outline the definition for those who are new to relative humidity or who would like a reminder. Relative humidity is a measure of the amount of water vapour in the air given as a percentage of the maximum amount of water vapour that air can hold at that temperature. You can see the basic equation written out here. In general terms, this means that the lower the percentage, the drier the air, and the higher the percentage, the more humid the air, with 100% RH being the full saturation of air at a given temperature. The equation also shows the intrinsic link between temperature and relative humidity. The temperature of the air dictates how much water vapour the air can hold. Hot air can hold more water vapour than cold. This means that a change in RH can be initiated through a change in temperature. In general, if temperature increases, then RH will decrease. If temperature decreases, then RH will increase. It is difficult to generalize incorrect and correct temperature and RH levels, as these are dependent on an object's material composition and construction. Some materials and construction methods are more sensitive to temperature and RH than others. Let's have a look at some incorrect temperature and RH levels and the damage that they can cause to historic objects and interiors. Temperature, as I have just explained, is primarily of interest because of the direct effect it has on relative humidity, although it can cause damage in its own right as well. High temperatures can cause adhesives and coatings to heat up and become tacky. In extreme cases, this can lead to failure of adhesive joins and dust adhering to object surfaces. Adhesives and coatings may have been used in the original construction of objects or during conservation. The table leg in the picture on the left has been repaired using an adhesive. High temperatures may cause the adhesive to become tacky and contribute to the repair failing, which is what has happened to the object in the right-hand picture. The temperature at which adhesives and coatings become tacky is specific to the material used. Relative humidity conditions primarily affect objects made from organic materials, that is, materials relating to an organism or living entity. This includes wood, bone, leather, paper, natural fibres such as wool and linen, etc., and natural history specimens, amongst others. These types of materials are particularly affected by RH as they contain water as part of their internal construction. The internal moisture content of these objects can be directly affected by the water vapour in the air. For example, in low RH, the moisture content of organic object materials is reduced and can cause the object to contract an infinitesimal amount. In high RH, the moisture content of organic materials is increased and can cause the object to expand an infinitesimal amount. The construction of an object made from organic material may not allow for the changes in dimensions caused by the fluctuations in RH and can cause pressure to build up, especially if the low, high, and fluctuating RH are regular occurrences. This can lead to damage to the objects, such as cracking in low RH and warping in high RH, and both during fluctuating RH. You can see in the picture of the table as high RH levels have caused the folded over tabletop leaf to warp out of shape. It may be helpful to think of it in this way. As humans, we are multicellular organisms and therefore sensitive to RH in the same way as museum objects made from organic materials. We can feel when RH is low or high, and our body is affected by it. For example, we may experience dry and cracked skin in the winter months when RH and temperatures are low. For objects that are composed of organic and inorganic materials, so materials that are not related to an organism or living entity, the expansion and contraction of the organic materials in relation to the RH can cause damage to neighbouring inorganic materials, which are not similarly affected. For example, the wood of the keyboard instrument in the picture has warped due to the high RH levels. The warping or expansion of the organic material has put pressure on the inorganic metal hook used to secure the lid of the keyboard and caused it to snap. Additionally, even in an object that is made entirely of organic materials, the organic materials will not necessarily expand and contract at the same rate in relation to the RH levels. The base wood and wood veneer in the object pictured have expanded and contracted at different rates under the fluctuating relative humidity, causing pressure to build up and over time force the veneer to become detached from the base wood. Relative humidity can also cause substantial damage to metal objects. High RH conditions can encourage corrosion of metals, causing loss of surface detail, loss of structural stability, and in worst case scenario, complete destruction of the object. How vulnerable the object is to corrosion depends on the metal used. For example, gold and silver are noble metals, which means they are stable and will not corrode. However, gold and silver objects are very rarely pure and are often found to be alloyed with other baser metals, in particular copper, which does make them more vulnerable to corrosion. Iron is a particularly reactive metal and will corrode easily in high RH conditions. The picture shows painted iron railings corroding due to damp conditions. Metals from an archaeological context are particularly unstable and should be kept in low RH environments of under 35% or under 12% for iron. Historic metals are more stable and can be stored and displayed in environments of higher RH. But it's important to remember, as the RH increases, the risk of corrosion also increases. For objects that have metal components alongside other materials, in particular textiles, corrosion products can cause staining to the neighbouring materials. Fluctuating relative humidity can also cause substantial damage to objects which have been saturated with soluble salts. This is most likely to affect objects that have come from a burial or coastal context, or construction materials that have been affected by rising damp. So this includes archaeological objects, shipwreck artifacts, and buildings in areas where the groundwater contains specific soluble salts. The salts enter the object whilst dissolved in water. As the object dries, or as the RH drops, the salts crystallise at or just beneath the surface of the object, obscuring and sometimes removing the surface. In fluctuating RH, the salts continue to dissolve and crystallise, leading to more and more damage to the object, and can lead to complete destruction. The left photo shows salts crystallising from the mortar between these tiles near the base of a wall in a historic house. The salts have probably entered the wall from groundwater due to rising damp and have crystallised as the RH has dropped and the wall has dried. If this continues, the tiles could become loose and fall from the wall. The right photo shows a bottle cork. The object is from a maritime context, and salts probably entered the object during its time in the sea. As the object has dried, the salts have crystallised. Notice that the salts only affect the porous cork material rather than the glass. The object needs to be able to absorb water for salts to enter the object. In addition to causing direct damage to objects, incorrect temperature and RH can work with other agents of decay to cause damage. Where variables work together to cause damage, it is called synergy. High RH conditions, above 65%, provide the perfect conditions for mould growth. Mould typically grows on objects made from organic materials, but will also grow where there is organic staining or surface deposition on inorganic objects. You can see in the pictures the white mould growing on the wood and leather components of the diorama. It is particularly concentrated around the area where the operator would have kept their hand, where there is probably a buildup of organic residues, attractive to mould. Mould will feed off organic substances, causing biological breakdown of the makeup of the material. It will also cause visible staining, which may not be able to be removed. Mould is also a health risk for humans, and it is important that when dealing with a mould outbreak within a museum, that the correct PPE is worn to prevent injury. Mould will mostly cause respiratory problems, so FFP3 face masks should be worn, as well as gloves, when dealing with mouldy objects. In another example of synergy, high RH and warm temperature conditions provide the perfect environment for insect pests to flourish. There are many types of insect pests which feed on different materials found in a museum context. Organic objects are again most at risk. The pictures show damage to a wicker basket and wicker picnic set caused by furniture beetle larvae. The larvae have been eating the wicker and have emerged as adult furniture beetles, leaving small piles of frass below their exit holes in the picture on the left. The picture on the right shows one of these larvae in the process of feeding. Materials are weakened from pests feeding off them. This leads objects to become structurally fragile and can lead to complete destruction if pest activity continues undisturbed. High temperature and RH levels can also lead to an increase in other deterioration mechanisms. For example, chemical deterioration from pollutants, such as the tarnishing of this silver candle sconce, as well as chemical deterioration of inherently unstable materials, including some photographs and plastics. We've seen a small snapshot of how different materials react to temperature and RH, and what damage can be caused. So how can we define the correct temperature and RH conditions for the needs of a mixed collection? It is a genuine case of we can't please everyone, so we go with the aim of trying to please most people, or most objects. What most materials prefer is a mid-range temperature, so between 5 degrees and 22 degrees. That's above freezing and below what we think of as hot temperatures. A mid-range RH between 40% and 65%, so above the threshold where organic objects suffer dramatic contraction, and below the threshold for mold growth and most pest activity. And less than 10% fluctuation in 24 hours to reduce the risk of expansion and contraction in organic objects and dissolution and crystallization of salts. An additional consideration that has to be made in a museum context is the comfort of the people who work at and visit the museum. This generally means that the lower temperature threshold is adjusted upwards to ensure human comfort, raising 5 degrees to 16 degrees. For more vulnerable collection materials that are not stable within these parameters, microclimates can be made for objects on display and in store to provide more specialised conditions. For example, for archaeological metals and inherently unstable materials such as photographs and plastics. So well done for making it this far. Now that we have had a look at some of the risks associated with incorrect temperature and RH, we can have a pause for any questions that may have come up, if there are any.
At the moment, Charlotte, there are no questions in the chat. So this is a good time to remind people, feel free throughout the session to just tap in your questions as they come up. And there'll be moments like this where we'll pause and read out every question that comes through. So I'll just pause for a second. If does anyone have any questions, feel free to tap them through right now. I don't see anything coming through. So Charlotte, I think—
Will I continue?
We'll continue.
Great.
Actually, I'm going to pause. There's one or two questions that just popped up. So someone has just mentioned some advice. Best way to control paper-based items in very low RH environment. Question. Many are dry and brittle. So what is the best way to control paper-based items in very low RH environment?
Well, you can try and raise the RH in that environment if dry RH is a problem. If in particular, if the objects are if the archive is in a store or a small storeroom, you could look at putting a humidifier in there to raise the RH a bit. If you're noticing problems with papers becoming brittle, that may be an option for you. If it's only affecting some of the archive, it may be that you could put them in a sort of smaller micro environment that you could control with a buffering material, which I will say more about in during the presentation. But if I haven't answered the question at the end, then please do ask again.
We've got a couple more questions. One person says, what about fresh air?
Fresh air is, so airflow in a museum is a good thing, because if you have stagnant areas of air, you could possibly have microclimates in your museum. So it's common in sort of neglected corners to have damp environments. So if you've got a good airflow in your museum, that means that the air is circulating and it reduces the risk of having these damp or dry little corners in your museum that could affect the objects in them places. Although the other thing you do have to think about with fresh air is, what is that fresh air bringing in with it? So is the fresh air coming in through a window or a door? Are there pollutants outside that are coming in? So are you near a busy road or a roundabout, things like that, construction sites? If you're allowing fresh air into the building, you could see problems with your objects because of pollutants. Although if you're not in an area with lots of pollutants, then fresh air is quite a good thing. But you do have to think about how it will affect your environment. Will it lower the RH? Will it raise the RH? It's got to be specific to your museum. You're on mute, Carolyn.
I'm sorry. We have one more question in this round, and that is, given lower temperatures can't hold as much moisture in the air, how concerned should we be about a high RH at, say, 10 degrees?
So a high RH at 10 degrees will do the same degradation as a high RH at a higher temperature. You may see less deterioration because high temperatures tend to increase chemical deterioration. So low temperature will reduce that for things like photographs and plastics. But the high RH will probably cause more of a problem than the low temperature will help, if that makes any sense. So you're better to have a lower RH and a slightly higher temperature than a low temperature with a high RH. I think hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, and that's all the questions for now.
Great. Shall I move on? Okay. So now we know a bit more about the temperature and RH conditions that we're trying to provide in museums. We can look at the measures that are available to monitor and control them. Before control is introduced, it is important that monitoring has taken place and you understand the environment that you're trying to control. It is recommended that monitoring take place for at least a year prior to control being introduced, as dramatic changes in conditions can be seen over the different seasons, and any control method will need to reflect this. So what methods can be used to monitor the temperature and RH? Monitoring can be undertaken using handheld devices like this one. This particular model is called an LSEC environmental monitor and can be used to take spot readings of temperature and RH, as well as visible light and UV. As it is a handheld device, a member of staff has to operate it and record the results of the spot check. If regular spot checks are undertaken in the same place at the same time every week, then a basic overview of seasonal condition changes can be mapped, although the full environmental picture will not be seen, as it is unlikely you will or can gain access to the museum at night to take readings, and there is a limit to the amount of readings you can take regularly throughout the day. It is nonetheless useful for gaining a basic picture and for supplementing the data that can be gained from the next devices. A more comprehensive picture of the environment can be gained from monitoring with data loggers. These electronic devices will take regular temperature and RH readings at a time interval that can be dictated during setup. For example, every hour. The data needs to be regularly downloaded. The memory lasts about a year before the data starts rewriting itself, depending on the time interval and how many readings the data logger is taking. However, it is best to download more often than this. so that you can react to any problematic environmental conditions. As the data collection does not rely on a person to be physically present when collected, more readings can be taken which reflect conditions over a 24-hour period. Therefore, a more complete picture of the environmental data is provided. The main drawback with this method is that data you are reviewing is not live. You can only react to negative environmental conditions after downloading the data. And by this time, the problem may be months in the past. There are several different makes available. The most common types include TinyTag, Meco, and Hamwell. These electronic data loggers replace the more old-fashioned drum thermohygrographs, which are being phased out in preference to the data loggers, which provide electronic data as opposed to physical graphs. And there's your thermohygrograph. Probably the most effective monitoring system is the telemetric environmental monitoring system. These can provide the same data as the data loggers, with the added bonus of being able to access live data. The data is transmitted almost instantaneously to computer software where it can be accessed and viewed live. Newer systems offer remote login access so that data can be reviewed from any outlet with internet access. This means that reactions to poor environmental conditions can happen straight away before conditions become damaging to collections. The two main companies that provide this technology are Hamwell and Meco. The only drawback is that these systems are generally more expensive to set up. For all the monitoring devices so far mentioned, there is a need to maintain them to keep them in working order. This includes regularly changing batteries and regularly calibrating about once a year to make sure the data they collect is accurate and reliable. So data loggers and telemetric systems will give you an electronic graph that looks something like this, plotting temperature and RH together so that the relationship between the two can be seen. On this graph, the temperature is in red and the RH is in blue. This is a graph showing the conditions for a relatively uncontrolled indoor space. We can see higher temperatures and lower RH during the summer, and lower temperatures and high RH in the winter. Looking at the data over different time periods, a year, a month, a day, will reveal different patterns in the environmental conditions, which you will need to analyse and understand before implementing control. Lastly, before moving on to methods of control, I want to mention paper humidity strips, which are a much simpler form of RH monitor. The paper strip contains chemicals which change colour as the RH changes. The RH is red at the point of colour change. This does not provide a record of data, but only shows the current conditions. They are useful for monitoring in closed spaces, including inside display cases and storage boxes, especially if trying to maintain a microclimate. Spot readings can be taken and recorded if need be, although the paper strip only reads RH to the nearest 10%, so is not the most accurate. They've been used here to monitor the low RH microclimate inside the storage box. The strip can be seen from outside the box and can show when the control within the box needs to be renewed. So when you have your year's minimum worth of data, what control do you need and what options are available? It is necessary to look closely at your monitoring data to choose a system of control that fits. What environment are you trying to maintain? Is this the same for all spaces? Is control needed to decrease or increase the RH? Is control needed all year round and in all spaces? Before introducing active control methods, it is worth considering whether the environment could be regulated by undertaking simple improvements to the building and internal arrangements. For example, if solar gain through windows on sunny days can be seen to affect internal RH levels, then installing blinds to manage this may be effective. Additionally, encouraging visitors to leave wet coats and umbrellas at the entrance on rainy days may reduce RH levels in the galleries to acceptable levels without further intervention. Increasing air circulation within galleries and stores can also be beneficial to reduce pockets of high humidity. This can be done by increasing airflow in confined spaces, for example behind paintings, hanging on walls by introducing cork or plasterboard blocks behind the painting to lift it slightly away from the wall, allowing the air to circulate. Fans can also be used to increase air movement in stagnant spaces. Clearly, repair and maintenance of the building envelope is also essential to prevent ingress of damp and moisture, for example, through ill-fitting doors and windows or from blocked gutters. If this has all been thought about and control is still needed to regulate the temperature and RH, then the following options are available. If RH levels are generally high and need reducing, then low-level background heating will slightly increase the internal temperature and reduce the RH. Constant low-level background heat is better for collections than what conservators call comfort heating, high levels of heat during the day for visitor and staff comfort, followed by no heating overnight, as this can cause large fluctuations in temperature and RH, which, as we have seen, is not good for objects. Ideally, heating in a museum setting would be controlled by a humidistat rather than a thermostat, so the heating can be activated by high RH levels and deactivated by low RH levels. Humidistats can be integrated with existing heating systems or be installed with freestanding electric heaters, which can be seen in the pictures. Another method of reducing RH is by dehumidification, using a desiccant dehumidifier. Dehumidifiers work best in enclosed spaces such as stores. They struggle to effectively control the environment in large rooms. They use less energy to run than heating control and can also be controlled by a humidistat, so can switch on and off depending what target RH is set. Unless plumbed in, dehumidifiers need to be emptied regularly of the water that they extract from the environment. If they become full, they will automatically shut off, which has consequences for the environment and the collection. In the United Kingdom, with our cold and damp climate, the primary need is to reduce RH in museum settings. However, there are occasions when there is a need to increase the RH. For example, in a historic house that is still used as a private residence that has high heating for comfort levels, humidification may be needed to reduce the dehumidification effect of the heating. Humidifiers can be used to achieve this, again controlled by a humidistat. Like dehumidifiers, these work best in enclosed spaces and will need regular filling with water or will stop functioning. I will only touch on air conditioning and HVAC systems as a way to control the environment. Air conditioning is a large-scale, expensive system to install, so it's not an option open to all museums. However, it is a successful way of controlling the temperature and RH. The running costs of an air conditioning system are more than with other systems, and there are some drawbacks, such as not being able to operate effectively above 26 degrees, and unless they are fitted with adequate chemical filters, the system will bring external pollutants into the museum environment, which can present increased deterioration risks to objects. So in addition to the electronic systems we have looked at, there are also artificial buffers that are available that can help to create small microclimates of particular RH for objects that are not stable in the mid-range RH maintained in most museums. Silica gel, ProSorb, and ArtSorb can be placed into sealed display cases and storage boxes to create specific environmental conditions, such as low RH. It is important to buy the buffer preconditioned to the correct environment for the microclimate you are wanting to achieve. ProSorb and ArtSorb are mostly used to stabilise the mid-range RH conditions in environments that can't be closely controlled, whereas silica gel can be used to create low RH microclimates, as the one for archaeological objects in the picture. The silica gel bag can be seen at the top of the picture. The buffers need to be regularly reconditioned once their effectiveness has worn off, and therefore the environment needs to be monitored in order to tell how frequently this needs to be done. So I can definitely see some more questions coming in now, so I think it's a good time to pause and have a look at what they are.
Okay. I'll just warn you, Charlotte, that occasionally your audio mutates and gets drawn out and slow, and it's a bit fuzzy. So
oh no, that must be maybe my internet's playing up.
So I just want to
that.
remind everyone, if you miss a section or something that Charlotte's saying, feel free to type that into the chat and we'll repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a reminder that we will be circulating all of the notes and the slides after the session, so you'll have access to the information as well if something wasn't quite clear. But why don't I read through some of the questions? The first one is, how often do tiny tags need to be calibrated?
The general advice is every year. However, that does depend on what environment they are in. It's best to have a look at the manufacturer's recommendations, and I'm not sure what that is off the top of my head, but I think it's about every year. That's what most data loggers say. And I think the company can do that, or there are people who hire themselves out to do that. So basically what that entails is there are specific salt environments that you can attach to the data logger, and that can, what RH should be shown by the data logger, and depending on what RH is shown by the data logger, you can adjust that to show the correct. So it's just basically changing the calculations within the machine to make sure that it's reading the environment correctly. But yeah, every year is recommended. Sorry, go on.
Okay. The next question is quite a long one, so feel free to have a sip of water while I read that. And you might need a pen and paper. We use tiny tags in our store and download once a month. We have a controlled store space that within that, different rooms for geology, social history, and archaeology. We seem to get a humidity drift which circles front to back in the building as to which area has higher RH and dehumids needing to work. Breeze block construction with ceilings with thick insulation, no windows. We control with dehumidifiers and background heating. And yeah, that's where it ends.
Was there a question in there? Are we wondering about why the damp is circulating? Is that the?
If you can answer to that, and then if the person, Caroline, if you want to follow up with any clarity, feel free to put that into the chat.
The initial answer is I'm not sure. If you don't notice anything in particular that is causing that, I would find it difficult to make a comment without seeing the spaces. It might be something to do with airflow in the museum, if maybe damp air is entering somewhere and is making its way around the museum, but I wouldn't be able to say with any certainty.
Okay, so yeah, it says, sorry, it's about why is it circulating.
Okay.
This is a good time to remind all of the Southeast Museum participants that we are able to arrange for one-to-one surgeries with Spencer and Fry for free. So you would just need to contact your local museum development officer, and we can arrange that, so that if you've got really site-specific questions and queries, we can set you up with Spencer and Fry. And in some cases, if a site visit is required and it's safe in your tier, then we can arrange for that as well. Next question is, How gradually should you reduce RH using a dehumidifier? Could you do it too quickly and cause damage to an object? How do you go about conditioning or reconditioning silica gel to the required RH?
That's a good question, yes. If your collection has been sat at an RH for a long time, and you suddenly introduce dehumidification, that can cause problems with the objects as they dry out very quickly. So it is best, if you're trying to recondition the objects to a more safe RH, that you do that slowly. So if your collection has been in, what, say 70% RH for a while, you'd maybe try to reduce that gradually in increments, so down to 65 for a while, and then down to 60, and as it acclimatizes to that, then move further down to the RH that you'd like. There was a lot of, so when heating was introduced into historic houses suddenly, when we got the centralized heating systems, a lot of wood in these historic houses dried out too quickly, and cracking occurred. So that is a really important point to make, that if you do have a collection that is acclimatized to particular conditions, you will have to carefully recondition them. And it's kind of the same thinking as reconditioning silica gel. Silica gel reacts as an organic object. That's what a buffer is. Well, it's an artificial buffer as opposed to an organic object. So if you notice that your silica gel isn't producing the RH that you are wanting, you need to dry that silica gel out again so that it can absorb more moisture. So you can do this in-house if you have the technology. So I have worked at museums in the past that have special silica gel ovens. Well, they're not necessarily special silica gel ovens, but they're ovens that can function at a high temperature. And you put the silica gel in, dry it out, using monitors to check what the RH is, so that you can get it to a specific point. If you can't do that in-house, then I think there are people who can do that for you, as well as the manufacturers probably able to offer that service as well, maybe an exchange service. I hope that.
How high does the oven have to be to dry it out?
It depends where you're trying to. I think the ones that I have operated in the past, they were like big industrial ovens. So I think they operated at a slightly higher temperature than a normal domestic oven. I can't remember off the top of my head what in particular that temperature was, but I can have a look and maybe put it on the handout, give you a bit more information about reconditioning silica gel. But I think if you don't have the resources in-house, then you can outsource that, and I will have a look into that as well, where you can find that out.
Okay, we have one more question in this round. So is it possible that a very dry environment damages the tiny tag monitor's ability to record data? We have one in an archaeological dry store, which records very strange looking graph, very fuzzy looking.
Yes, I think I've certainly known occasions where very damp environments have caused the metal parts of the data logger to corrode. So I wouldn't be surprised if very dry environments have an effect as well. I'm not sure. I have Hanwell monitor data loggers work okay in environments around 35%. I'm not sure how dry you're talking, but it is possible, I think. I haven't known personally, like I say, I've only known the damp, but it is likely. And I'm not sure what you can do about that. I'm afraid.
Okay, and that's it for the questions for this round.
Great. Let's continue a bit further. So just going to spend a bit of time relating what we have learned to the museum benchmarks. So museums use the tool benchmarks in collections care to review collection care practices and make improvements. You may be familiar with them. The benchmarks are free to download online and cover all aspects of collections care, including environmental monitoring and control. It is good practice to undertake the benchmarks checklist regularly so that improvements in practice can be tracked and unknown deficiencies can be highlighted. The current version in use is version 2.1. This will be replaced with a more streamlined version 3 in 2021. But for now, let's focus on version 2.1. The benchmarks are organised into basic, good, and best actions. And by filling in whether you have met, partially met, or not met each benchmark, a rating is acquired on whether your museum practices are basic, good, or best. Let's have a look at the benchmarks that relate to environmental monitoring and control for temperature and relative humidity conditions. So don't worry, I won't mention all of the benchmarks applicable to environmental monitoring and control of temperature and relative humidity, but I will highlight a few across the basic, good and best categories for monitoring and control that relate to the issues that we have talked about today and show how they may be of use to guide the improvement of collection care practices at your museum. So firstly, benchmark 6.1, the need for environmental monitoring of collections is understood and stores are regularly visited and environmental monitoring equipment is in use. And 7.1, staff are aware of and understand the need to control the environment. So we're focused today on understanding the need for environmental monitoring and control in areas that house collections. So you are well on your way to achieving these benchmarks. Benchmark 6.5, the temperature and relative humidity requirements of different materials in the collection are understood. Again, we've covered some of the main requirements of materials during this training session, so there's another tick. And benchmark 7.3, simple measures such as closing doors, moving lights, providing entrance mats and controlling temperature and light levels are taken to improve the environment of stores and display areas. So before introducing the different control methods available, I encourage you to look closely at your museum to see if there are any simple measures that could be made. Hopefully you have already started to think about how you can fulfill this benchmark. So for the good benchmarks, 6.11, a programme for the calibration and maintenance of environmental monitoring equipment is in place. I mentioned that all environmental monitoring devices will need to be maintained and calibrated to be in correct working order. This is essential, otherwise your monitoring data is compromised. Resources ideally need to be allocated to this maintenance at the point of establishing environmental control in your museum. It should not be an afterthought. And benchmark 7.13, controlled environments are maintained for vulnerable items. We've discussed the need for microclimates for more vulnerable objects. So hopefully you've been thinking about that as well. And lastly, out of the best benchmarks. 6.19, your organisation regularly reviews the environmental monitoring needs of the collection, and recommendations are made to managers in the context of your environmental monitoring records and evaluations. And 7.23, your organisation regularly reviews the environmental control needs of the collection, and recommendations are made to managers in the context of your environmental monitoring records and evaluations. These actions focus on the importance of regularly reviewing the needs of your collection, using your familiarity with the collection and your knowledge gained through training to review and update the environmental needs of the collection. The benchmarks are a useful and free resource that I encourage you to undertake as a follow-on from this training to support and guide you in implementing collection care policies at your museum. And finally, let's talk a bit about COVID-19 and the challenges that it has introduced for the museum environment. So the main challenge that I think we can all relate to is the struggle to access museums to undertake essential tasks during the COVID-19 lockdown. We have had to question what our essential tasks are and persuade others of their importance. Restricted access can have a considerable impact on effective environmental monitoring and control, for some methods more than others. Clearly, if you're reliant on taking regular spot checks or downloading data from data loggers in order to review environmental monitoring data, then restricted access to the museum is going to have an impact. If you are lucky enough to have a telemetric system where the data can be accessed from any electronic platform for an internet login, then you are fortunate in being able to continue to monitor the conditions, although access is still an issue if you need to react to the monitoring data or maintain control methods such as emptying dehumidifiers. So how can we work to reduce the negative effects of restricted access? We are maybe past the worst, making it through the long spring lockdown and recently emerging from the second wave lockdown. We're hopeful that a vaccine on the horizon may herald better times to come. However, it is always a good idea to review what we have learned from these experiences to better plan for the future. Reduced access means that tasks need to be prioritised. If you are only able to access the museum once a week, then what are the tasks that are most important? This might be downloading your environmental monitoring data, undertaking environmental spot checks using a handheld monitor, and visual spot checks on the collections, quickly checking for immediate problems, emptying dehumidifiers, filling humidifiers, changing exhausted silica gel, looking for causes of environmental anomalies highlighted by your environmental data. It is important to have a plan to maximise the time that is available. Your long-term plans may have been adjusted to include the upgrade of your environmental monitoring system so that it can be accessed and reviewed remotely without on-site access being necessary. We will all have learned our own lessons from the lockdown, and if you want to share with us, then please do so during the question section. The second challenge that has emerged from the pandemic is how to react to the scientific data being disseminated by researchers studying the virus. In particular, the studies that have shown how the persistence of COVID-19 surviving on surfaces is affected by different environmental conditions. Specifically, that COVID-19 survives for longer in colder, drier environments. But before we all rush back to our museums to adjust the environmental control settings to create warm and humid environments, it is best to make sure we understand what temperature and RH is being discussed. Research has shown that although the survival rate of the virus on surfaces reduces as the RH increases, this reduction is not linear. Increasing the RH from 40% to 60% has a much bigger effect on reducing the survival rate of the virus than the comparative change of increasing RH to above 60%, which also has the negative impact of allowing mould growth. In addition, the higher temperatures that have the most impact on the survival rate of the virus, we're talking about an increase up to 35 degrees, are not sustainable and are undesirable for collections and for human comfort. Therefore, current thinking suggests that our average museum environmental conditions, whilst not inhospitable to the virus, are not likely to make major gains by changing, and could in fact increase the risk of respiratory illness with the added likelihood of mould growth. Additional concerns have been made about the movement of air within indoor spaces and how this can affect the spread of COVID-19, in particular with reference to air conditioning systems and dehumidifiers and humidifiers that process and move air. There is evidence that airflows from air conditioning units can help to disperse the COVID-19 particles from an infected person to those nearby, therefore increasing their risk of contagion. But there is currently no evidence to show humidifiers and dehumidifiers pose the same risk. HEPA filters have been shown to remove COVID-19 particles and should be used in air conditioning units to lower the risk. And these are commonly already in place in museum air conditioning systems. As we are spending more time indoors, the government has been advising us to keep inside venues ventilated, with windows and doors kept open as much as possible. It is important that consideration is given to the effect on the environment that this additional ventilation may cause, and to consider the risk of increased pollutants accessing the museum through open doors and windows, and carefully manage the risks to collections alongside the risks to human health. But I don't want just to talk about the negatives. There have also been some benefits to the COVID-19 pandemic. Less visitors may be a negative in terms of income and education, but can also be seen as a benefit. Visitor numbers can have a massive impact on the environmental conditions within a museum. Lack of visitors may have improved the conditions within the museum. At the very least, the environmental data will show how the museum environment naturally acts without visitors and staff affecting the conditions. By comparing the data for this year with previous years, we may be able to truly measure the effect that visitors have on the museum environment. During the second lockdown, many of us were able to continue working on site, even though museums were closed to visitors. This may have given the time and opportunity to address tasks that often get overlooked when dealing with a museum open to the public every day. For example, to undertake a deep clean of stores. So please share with us any benefits that have affected you and your museum. And I'll have another pause for some questions and a bit of a breather.
So we do have, okay, so what environmental control would an entrance mat affect? Is it just visitors tracking in dirt and pests?
Yes, so dirt is a primary reason for entrance mats. The other thing, on rainy days, you'll notice that a lot of water comes in on people's feet. So entrance mats, particularly, absorbent entrance mats, can reduce the amount of water being tread into the museum. And it's surprising how water from people's shoes, people's coats and umbrellas can affect the conditions in the galleries. So it's not just dust, it's also water as well.
Okay. The next question we have is, we have seen huge daily fluctuations in temperature and RH since reopening to the public in August, as we followed government advice to open ventilation, meaning that the outside weather has a greater impact. Do you have any suggestions on how to reconcile the increased ventilation with GIS temp and RH guidelines? Is this something that other venues have experienced?
Yeah, I think it is a very common side effect of increasing ventilation in museums, and it is unfortunate for us as we're trying to control the conditions. However, I'm not sure that there's a magic answer to that, as obviously human health trumps the health of collections. However, if ventilation can be maybe directed at areas, so if you can open windows that are slightly away from collections, maybe rather than those that are directly near them, it may be that although the environment of the room changes, the objects might be less affected. They may, especially if they're in display cases, their little microclimate within the display case should hopefully be buffered to some extent. But it's not an easy question to answer. Obviously, we will see fluctuations, especially now that we're in winter and it's quite damp outside. Yeah, sorry, I don't really have a solution.
That's all the questions we have in this round.
Great. Right, well, I've finished the official presentation, but as we have time, I have got some slides with some examples of environmental data that I thought we could go through and just have a look as to what they might show, how we might read them. So we'll move on with that. So reading temperature and relative humidity graphs. So what I'm showing you is some example environmental monitoring that I undertook of a room, not in a museum. It was actually a bedroom, but it just gives some idea of how you can read graphs and what they might relate to and how you might be able to affect the conditions that you're seeing. So this is the first graph. This is over a 24-hour period. So it's a graph showing the environmental conditions fluctuating over one day. Annoyingly for me, this makes no sense. The temperature is blue and the relative humidity of red in this graph. I always associate temperature with red, but here we go. So you can see two peaks in this graph where the temperature rises and the relative humidity decreases. And then again here. And then correspondingly where the temperature decreases, the RH increases. So I know that the room in question had heating on at specific times of the day, and I am able to correlate the increase in temperature for these two peaks with the start of the heating in this building. So what we're seeing here is an environment that is very much dictated to by the heating system. So that's important when you're looking at your graphs. It's important to know, to think about what effects might affect your environment. So that includes heating, external conditions, any human activity in the room. So here we can quite clearly see the effect of heating. And this is even more dramatic as we see this further diurnal graph. So graph for a day. I know that on this day, the heating was not functioning. And what we can see is a very steady temperature and relative humidity with very little fluctuations, no peaks, no troughs. So we can say that actually in this environment, the heating has a big impact on the environmental conditions. So if you wanted to reduce the fluctuations seen in the previous graph, we would switch the heating off. And then we would get these conditions. So temperature at about 20 degrees, RH just below 60. So within our recommended medium parameters, maybe a tiny higher than some people might like, but below the 60–65% RH, where mold growth and pests become a problem. So as well as looking at the daily fluctuations, we can look at weekly fluctuations to see what might be affecting the environment and how we can control. So this is a 2-week period. And we can see in the first week, the temperature, it does fluctuate, but it's not as dramatic as the second week. And again, in relation to the temperature, the RH does fluctuate in the first week, but becomes much more dramatic in the second week. And I know that in the first week, the heating system was switched off and there was no human activity in the room. So these are the natural, normal conditions of the room without the influence of heating and human activity, which can affect the temperature and RH. And the second week, the heating was switched on and human activity of the room resumed. So that human activity in particular was, well, it was a student bedroom, so a student lived there. So someone sleeping, working. So you can see in relation to this, the habitation of the room and the increase in temperature from increase and drops in temperature from the heating system switching on and off have increased the effect, the fluctuating effect of the temperature and relative humidity. As well as this, the temperature has generally increased from in between sort of around 15, just over 15 to above 20 on average. And the RH has started to drop in relation to this. So again, this room is showing that the central heating and the habitation of the room is important on the effect of the environment. So this is data for a month, and this is looking at a different effect that we might see on the conditions, internal conditions. So here we've got the internal temperature of the room compared with the external temperature. So this was gained from external weather data. And here we're just trying to look and see if the external temperature has any effect on the internal room. So we can see that actually there might be some impact. So these peaks are sort of replicated in the internal temperature of the room. However, obviously the temperature in the room is higher and the fluctuations are much less dramatic. So we can see that the room is buffered to quite an extent from the external conditions. And this was taken during a month where there was no heating in the room. So we're not seeing any other influence here except the external temperature. And with RH, same month, so no other influence on the environment. We can see maybe tiny correlation between, this is the internal and this is the external. Tiny correlation, so tiny peaks here corresponding to the much bigger peaks of the RH, but less so than with the temperature. And again, the RH inside is much less than the high RH inside. So we can say that there is some correlation between the external and internal environments, but it is buffered to quite some extent. So if we look at a month where there is heating and habitation of the room, as well as external pressures, we might find it a bit more difficult to find the correlation as there are more effects on the temperature. So we can see that there might still be some correlation. So this sort of peak here, sort of replicated here, and this peak here replicated here. Again, it's much more buffered, but you can also see that the temperature is much more fluctuating than in the previous graphs. So there are more input on that. So the heating and habitation has had an effect on that. And again, on RH, it's difficult to see any correlation between the external environment and the internal environment. And the RH is probably more affected by the internal heating and the habitation. So looking at them graphs, it is clear, well, I'm just trying to show how it is important to try and find out what is affecting the conditions. It's not enough just to monitor the environment, the temperature and RH. It's important to look at your data and to find out what is influencing it. So is it the external environment? Is it the heating system? Is it human activity, so visitors, staff? So once you understand what might be causing the RH and temperature to react the way it does, you can then start to think about, okay, so what can we do to control the reactions? So if the external environment has a large impact, can we insulate the internal environment more from the external? So can we close doors and windows? Can we replace ill-fitting doors and windows? Are there leaks in the building? If it's more the heating and human activity in the space, then is there a way we can change the heating to make it impact, to make it a positive impact rather than a negative impact? So instead of having comfort heating, which I mentioned, can we have more low-level conservation heating? Because it's clear that it is controlling the environment, but we want it to control to a specific level. So we'll finish with this last graph, which is showing the RH and temperature in a controlled environment. So this environment was controlled to a low RH as it was storing archaeological collections. So you can see with the RH, which confusingly we've gone back to red being temperature and blue being relative humidity. So this is the RH. You can see that every time it gets to about 35, it stops going upwards and it stabilizes for a while. And then it goes down again, and then it comes up and it stabilizes again at 35. There are a few odd peaks where it's not managed to control itself, but on the whole, it goes down, but it doesn't come up further than 35. So what we're seeing here is a humidistat that is programmed to 35%. So every time the humidity gets up to 35%, it will switch on the heating, it will switch on the dehumidifier, and it will attempt to prevent the RH from rising above 35%. And this is what you can see mirrored in the temperature. So here, as the humidity increases to 35%, we're here in the temperature, and the temperature suddenly shoots up in order to control the RH. So like I said, if you increase the temperature without increasing the moisture content of the water, the RH will drop. So that's what we're seeing here. So as well as trying to look at your graphs before implementing control to understand what's happening, it's important to keep analysing your graphs to see whether the control that you've put in is actually working. So if this wasn't evident, so for example, if these peaks were a more common occurrence, we need to ask what's happening there. Is the dehumidifier full? Is it not working? Is the heating system not switched on? So it's important to keep analysing your data, and I hope this little sort of introduction has helped you think a bit more about what your data is showing. And obviously, if you have any questions, then I can answer them now, or as Carolyn says, Spencer and Fry are here to help you through South East Museum Development Programme for specific queries. So I will finish that now, and feel free to ask any more questions.
So we definitely have one more question, and that is, I would be really keen to see examples of reports done by institutions. I'm struggling to make mine effective for advocacy. Are there any best practice examples online?
It's a good question. I'm not sure whether there, I would have to have a look for that because I've not seen any myself. I can have a think about that and maybe put that in the information that follows the presentation and the training. So I'll definitely look into that for you, because it's a good point. You need reports that speak to people outside conservation to make your point. So yeah, I'll get back to you on that. It's a good question.
Charlotte, am I right in thinking the benchmark toolkit from Collections Trust, you put in your data and it's a spreadsheet that's all formulated so that it makes a really clear statement about where there could be areas of concern?
Yes, so you put your ticks into the checklist on the spreadsheet, and it generates colourful graphs automatically, and you can export them. You can use them in reports, and it clear colour-coded statement of what we are doing, what we're not doing, where we need improvements. And if you do that every year, you can see where you've made improvements and see where maybe you've let the ball drop a bit. It's a really useful tool.
Yeah, and it's a free tool to download as well.
It is, yeah. So I will put the link on the handout, but if you just type in benchmarks in collections care into the internet, it will take you, and you can download a free Excel spreadsheet. Don't be put off by it says, oh, you can buy a PDF version or something. There's a link though where you can download the free Excel.
Okay. So we have another question. Our heating system in stores are fixed to comfort heating due to one heating system for whole building. Store doors are fire exits, so have to be shut at all times, and windows do not open. Have you come across ways to divert heat? For example, is humidifier helpful, especially if RH is low?
Yeah, this is a common problem where maybe museum heating systems haven't been updated for a while, so it's one big system and it's, you know, set to the normal comfort heating. It's a common problem. Yes, humidifiers can be used to raise the humidity if that's what you're seeing. The high heat levels are dropping the RH during the day. It's not ideal, obviously, because then you're doubling the energy to reduce the effect of the heating, but in a short-term problem, then yes, that can help. Some museums have found that although the heating is controlled centrally, you can adjust each radiator individually, but I'm sure you've probably looked into that, and you know, it's not ideal anyway, because you've got to walk around the museum and physically adjust each radiator, but I'm sure that's probably not an option for you. Apart from interventions, sort of trying to install controls on individual radiators, which I think you can do without changing the whole heating system, but again, obviously you've got to get funding for that, or permission for that. So I think, yes, maybe in the short term, your main option would be to install a dehumidifier, a humidifier, to increase the RH during the day when that comfort heating is probably blasting out. You can also try and maybe, I mean, it's difficult because everyone's stores are always chock-a-block, but if you can take objects sensitive to RH further away from the radiators, it may give them a bit of leeway. Although obviously if it's a small room with shut doors, then it will be, the conditions will get to all the objects eventually. You can obviously try and isolate objects in boxes, which any sort of storage material will buffer to some extent. But if it's an ongoing thing, then they might have already conditioned to the dry RH. So yeah, it's a difficult problem that many people face, and yeah, I think short-term humidification might be an option there.
Okay. We don't have any more questions, but we have a lot of people sending their thanks and saying it was a really interesting session.
Oh, good.
So I will extend my thanks to Charlotte for taking the time to put this together. We will be posting a recording of this session onto the Southeast Museum Development Program's YouTube channel via our website. We will be circulating notes and slides from this session as well. And it's just a reminder, as we've mentioned, that if you do want a one-to-one surgery with Spencer and Fry to get in touch with your local museum development officer. If you're not sure who that is, you can look on the Southeast Museum Development website, and under Teams, we've got all of our staff listed. And we can arrange that for Southeast museums. Thank you very much for everyone for attending and for putting up with our audio issues and for going through the chat system. It worked well. We had a lot of people in the session today. So I hope you got something out of it. And a reminder that our next session about preventive conservation is on the 11th of January about emergency planning. So hope to see some of you there. All right. Thank you.